Let's talk about World War One and how that happened. It's one of the big earth-shaking events in human history, and in this part of the semester, we're hitting high points as we get into the 20th century when everything goes crazy. Um, and how World War One happened, and the way that it involved everyone, even though practically no one wanted to be involved in that conflict, is a fascinating study. It begins with the rise of the idea of a nation state, which we tend to think is an ancient idea, and instead it's a very new idea in the world. Prior to the turn of the 19th into the 20th century, around that area time, which is you know less than 150 years ago, um, nations didn't define themselves by nationalist identities. Nations had kings, and you were a part of a kingdom, and this was all under this kind of odd sort of united web of allegiances that existed under the Roman Catholic Church. So that depending on who had married whom, right, which is a big deal in the Middle Ages, your king could be anybody from anywhere. This happens right all the way up until the American Revolutionary War. The King George that we fought against for independence wasn't a British person. He was a German. He just happened to be next in line to the British throne because of a bizarre web of marriages and allegiances. Um, People didn't think of themselves as English or French or German or American the way that we do now. Borders changed all the time, depending on who was king of whom and who had who had conquered whom, or who had won this or that battle. Um, Europe was a very fluid place, and America was too. By the way, this is long before when the colonies were being settled in this vast continent that is unexplored, right? And what the United States would look like, where that border would be drawn, was very fluid for a long time. But right around as the 19th century becomes the 20th century, people began to define themselves by their nation, and specifically by ethnicity and by language. And so that Germany, for instance, believed that everyone who spoke German and who shared a German ethnicity should be part of Germany. And they were willing to fight to make that happen. Vladimir Putin is doing that right now in the Ukraine. This is not a new thing he's doing. It's old. It goes all the way back to World War One, and it's it's a bad idea now as it was then. This idea that because these people in the Ukraine that are close to the Russian border speak Russian, a lot of them, they should be in Russia, and Putin is more than happy to use force to make that happen. Um, and so this is a new idea. And as these nation states began to form around this kind of nationalist spirit, people could see World War One coming a mile away. It's like this is not going to go well. And what happened was nations began making alliances with other nations that included mutual self-defense provisions, so that Russia, for instance, allied with Bosnia, and part of that agreement was, if anyone attacks you, it's the same as attacking me. We will all go to war together. And once Europe was kind of divided up into these nationalistic loyalties, and all of these treaties existed, the stage was set for anything to set this off. And it was anything. It was not a big deal. It was a horrible thing, but you wouldn't think would start a world war. But a Croatian nationalist assassinated an Austrian archduke, and touched all of this off. Austria decided that they were going to stomp on Croatia using this assassination as a pretext. But they were afraid that Russia would then attack them because of the relationship between Croatia and Russia. So they looked over their shoulder at Germany and said, "You got our backs?" And Germany said, "Yes, we do." And that started a whole cascade effect, which ended up with everybody at war with everybody else in Europe. And eventually the United States was drawn into this. Now, the practical side of World War II is also fascinating because World War II is the first World War I is the first industrial war, the first war where you have machines involved in ways that they never were before, which meant that the carnage was just unbelievable. People kind of got a precursor of this in the American Civil War as our technology on the battlefield got a little bit better than what it was in the Napoleonic days, in Revolutionary War days. But with World War I, things take an enormous leap forward. And you can map out the development of several new technologies on the battlefield that we still have to this very day. Machine guns make their first appearance in World War I. Airplanes used as weapons happens in World War I. Tanks, chemical weapons. These are all new, and these things make the battlefield just unbelievably bloody and devastating. And the numbers of people involved were just mind-boggling. In the Battle of the Somme, for instance, more than 1 million people died. Nothing like that had ever happened in human history. And and what was so tragic about this is that everybody could see it coming and nobody could stop it. And if you had asked any of the individual nations whether they wanted to be doing this once things got bad, they would have all said, "No, this is not good. We should not be doing this." And yet they could not keep from doing it because of the way the politics of that era worked and still do to this day. And this was an enormous blow to the world. We talked about how the Enlightenment brought this very promising era of new technology, new science, new discoveries, and there was a lot of optimism that the world would become a much better place. And the Industrial Revolution began to, betray that promise as the technology created these horrific working conditions for ordinary people instead of making their lives better. But World War I really put the last nail in that coffin of optimism, because all of this science and technology ends up being something we immediately used to destroy one another, and which is once again, I've said this before, it's true, right? Every technology we've ever made, we immediately turned into a weapon. Well, World War I shows where that's going. And just as people could see how science was progressing and technology was progressing, and they could think of futures in which, if this keeps going, the technology will get better and better. Well, once you apply that to war, it looks pretty grim. And sure enough, right, World War I happens in the very first decades of the 20th century. By the middle of that century, we have weapons that can destroy all life on Earth. So we go from rifles on the battlefield to nuclear bombs over the course of about 40 years. This is astonishing, right? If you look at the changes in weaponry that happen over time, you see this sudden leap forward, if you can call it a leap forward, from weapons that are pretty bad to weapons that can literally destroy all life on Earth. Astonishing. And so, with this thing happening, the world takes a very pessimistic turn, and art and literature and all sorts of expressions of creativity follow suit. You begin to see quite a bit of pessimistic and ugly art happening. expressing this. And we're going to look at a little bit of it. But one of the things that happens at this time as well is the rise of a particular kind of artist and particular understanding of art that's different. So we've looked at how Baroque art was meant to aggrandize its patrons, right? It had that purpose. Romantic art is meant to instill emotion in an audience, right? These are still art that is focused on pleasing an audience for the most part, creating some sort of positive reaction in an audience. Even monster stories, the Gothic horror that was invented by the Romantics is still meant to please the audience. We don't go to monster movies because we hate them, but with World War I and with the disaster that happens in Europe, a different kind of idea of art arises, where the artist isn't trying to please the audience. In fact, the artist is trying to horrify the audience. The artist is trying to offend the audience. The idea being that art should be a vehicle to astonish people into waking up. London, the poem London is kind of a precursor of that, right? That we looked at last week. No one who reads London, who was in London, right, should go, yay, that's awesome. That was the best thing I ever did, reading that. That makes me feel so good about London and myself. No, it's meant to create a sense of shame, a sense of unease, a sense of shock, and even outrage. If the nice, good, upstanding Victorian Londoner was offended by London, then William Blake would say, yes, I'm glad I did my job. You should be offended. Look at what you're doing. But that kind of idea of who the artist is really kind of takes off after World War I. And I want to look at a couple of paintings that illustrate this. And those are up in your supplemental material. So I'm sure that's where I used to put it. It's in course content. There are two pictures of paintings of a prostitute. One is called the Grand Odalisque. It is very much in the spirit of the Romantic movement. An odalisque is a Turkish word for harem girl, right? Prostitute. Not quite prostitute, different sort of thing, but definitely a kept woman and kept for sexual purposes is an odalisque. When you look at Ingra's painting, this woman is, she's kind of turned away and she's looking back over her shoulder kind of alluringly. This is all, this is Sports Illustrated swimsuit edition stuff in painting form, in the Romantic spirit, right? And this kind of exotic subject matter of the harem in Turkey, right? And this is very much something meant to please the audience, right? It's meant to appeal to the male gaze. And once again, this is nothing new, right? We see this kind of image all the time. It's also incredibly unrealistic. One of the biggest criticisms of this painting when it first came out is that if you count the vertebrae in her back, there are too many of them. And this might be a great example of very early sort of photoshopping, right? I don't care if this woman's body isn't physically possible. This is how I want to present her. And the expression in her face is kind of looking over her shoulder at the person who is looking at her, and it's kind of a very come hither sort of look. Once again, not an expression we're not used to seeing in our own cultural landscape with the images that we see all the time. You can see that look looking back at you from magazines at the checkout line. It's everywhere. But I want to contrast that with a painting by Manet called Olympia. And it's also a painting of a prostitute. But this is a woman that he actually knows. It was an actual prostitute that Manet knew. And he had her pose for this painting. And it's a very different kind of image. And it was incredibly controversial when he painted it. It created a lot of outrage. and for reasons that are fascinating to me, because it's not an idealized body, for one thing. This is what a person who's naked actually looks like. And she's looking at the audience, looking at us with a very frank sort of gaze. This isn't an eroticized version of a woman. This is a woman's naked body. And this is a woman looking at the audience as though she's a real person, which, the audience we're used to. As long as it was this, the Turkish harem girl, we're fine. But when it's a real person, not so much. And so what is Manet trying to do with that? Well, he's humanizing this person. He's taking a person that is seen as property, right? A woman for hire, a person you can buy, and turning her into a person. And the black woman, the servant behind her, is not accidental. This is called a metonymy. It's a special kind of metaphor. It's when two things comment on one another by their spatial relationship. So the woman, the black woman, right? And remember, this was painted. Dates of this, but the African slave trade is either still happening or very recent. Having a black servant in this painting with the prostitute is meant to comment on the nature of each of their jobs, right? Their existence. How is the prostitute any less than a slave? And if we are again, this is a French artist painting for a French audience. They were very much against the African slave trade in France. If and you can see why this might outrage people in France, right? It's saying, okay, you're not okay with Africans being used as slaves, but we have prostitutes everywhere in France. Maybe we should think about that. We should maybe include these women in the universal human dignity, right? That everyone ought to have. So this is art with a message, right? This is art meant to cause the audience to think about themselves, think about their attitudes towards the world, think about their attitudes towards women, and these are these are thoughts that we could have, right? These are things we need to think about even now. It's an interesting study, guys, to look at the way that women's bodies are portrayed in art and in media. How often is it an idealized body, an impossibly idealized body? And what is that doing for us? Right? Well, what is the expression on their face? It's an interesting thing to do. Next time you see a Sports Illustrated or any sort of set of images like that, look at the expressions on the faces and ask yourself, what are these people thinking? What's going on here? Right? What is this expression? Because it's not a normal expression. It's not a real expression. It's a different sort of thing that's happening. It's a fascinating study. It really is. But it's something we don't think about because we take it for granted. This is how women's bodies are depicted in this particular context. And so that's kind of what I want to get at here is this kind of changing sort of purpose of the artist. The artist as not meant to simply please the audience, but to challenge the audience, to cause the audience to look at the world in a different way with the purpose of maybe inaugurating some sort of change for the better. And we still have that. That's a big part of art to this very day. But it begins now. It begins with this particular kind of era. As the Industrial Revolution rolls along and World War I comes along, you have these artists saying, ah! They're not just simply here to make you feel good or make you feel things or to aggrandize someone or something. They're here to make us think. And we'll look at some more of that in the next week. But we're getting towards the end here. We're going to rush into the 20th century and some of the things that are happening in our current time because some of that stuff is really interesting. Sorry about the cat. I moved offices, obviously. And the cats then seem to think that this is a room they should absolutely be able to enter anytime they want to. So um, I'll have an announcement up about the test and what's going on as we come to the end of the semester, so be looking for that. And we're getting there, guys. We're almost to the end.